At 72 years old, Eleanor Marsh believed that a lifetime of selflessness would be repaid with love. She had spent 46 years raising 4 children, nursing a husband through 2 strokes, and holding a family together with nothing but stubbornness and grace. She never once asked for anything in return. She never once imagined she would need to. But on a freezing Tuesday morning in November, standing in the foyer of the home she had built from nothing, Eleanor watched her youngest son, Daniel, set a single black garbage bag on the tile floor and speak the 7 words that would shatter every belief she'd ever held. "We've decided it's time for you to go." There was no argument, no negotiation, no compassion in his voice, just the flat, practiced tone of someone who had rehearsed this moment in the car. Behind Daniel stood her daughter Karen, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the wall behind Eleanor's head, as if she weren't even in the room. Her oldest son, Martin, waited outside in the driveway, engine running, ready to drive her to wherever she ended up. Her second daughter, Patricia, hadn't even shown up. She'd sent a text that morning. "It's for the best, Mom, you'll see." For the best, as if erasing a 72-year-old woman from the only home she'd known for 3 decades was a kindness, as if tossing her belongings into a single trash bag was an act of mercy. Eleanor looked down at the garbage bag. They hadn't even given her a suitcase. If you've ever felt invisible to the people you sacrificed everything for, if you've ever been told that your presence was a burden by the very people you brought into this world, if you've ever stood in your own home and been told it was no longer yours, then this story was written for your heart. Welcome to Hearts Don't Rust. Subscribe now, because what Eleanor found when she descended those stone steps into her mother's cellar, sealed for 38 years, will make you believe that love protects its own, even from beyond the grave. Eleanor Ann Marsh was born Eleanor Ann Calloway in the spring of 1954 in a small river town in central Pennsylvania called Bartonville. Population 3,200, 1 grocery store, 2 churches, a feed supply shop, and a post office that doubled as a gossip exchange. Her mother, Rose Calloway, was the town's only seamstress, a woman who could turn flour sacks into Sunday dresses and make a nickel stretch until it screamed for mercy. Her father, Hank, worked the rail yard until his back gave out in 1971, and after that he fixed small engines out of the garage, charging just enough to keep the lights on and never enough to save. Eleanor was the youngest of 3. Her brother James left for the army the day he turned 18 and never came back to Bartonville except for funerals. Her sister Dorothy married a man from Harrisburg when Eleanor was 14 and moved away to a life that didn't include phone calls home. That left Eleanor alone with Rose and Hank in the small stone house on Riddle Creek Road, the house with the cellar. The cellar was Rose's domain. Everybody in Bartonville knew that. A heavy wooden door at the back of the house, framed in limestone, that had been there since the house was built in 1902, with iron hinges that groaned like old men getting out of chairs. Rose kept it padlocked. She went down there almost every evening after dinner, sometimes for 10 minutes, sometimes for 2 hours. When Eleanor would ask what she did down there, Rose would smile the way women smile when they're holding a secret they've earned the right to keep. "That's my thinking room, baby girl. Every woman needs a place that belongs only to her. Someday, you'll understand." Hank never questioned it. He'd sit in his recliner and watch the evening news while Rose disappeared behind that groaning door. And when she came back up, she always seemed lighter. calmer, like she'd set something heavy down in the dark and climbed the stairs without it. Eleanor graduated Bartonville High in 1972, class of 86 students, 43rd in her ranking. She wasn't brilliant, she'd be the first to tell you that, but she was steady, reliable, the kind of girl teachers trusted to collect homework and parents trusted to babysit. She took a job at the Bartonville Savings and Loan as a teller, earning $2.65 an hour, handing cash through a brass window to farmers and shop owners who knew her by name. That's where she met Gerald Marsh. He walked in on a Wednesday in October of 1975, 28 years old, broad-shouldered, wearing a sport coat that was slightly too big, and a smile that made Eleanor drop a stack of deposit slips. Gerald was new in town, hired as the assistant manager at the farm equipment dealership on Route 11. He was from Scranton, had a business degree from a community college nobody had heard of, and talked about the future like it was a room he'd already furnished and was just waiting to move into. He asked Eleanor to dinner that Friday. She said yes before he finished the sentence. They married in June of 1976. Eleanor was 22. Gerald was 29. The ceremony was at First Methodist, 47 guests. A cake Rose made herself with buttercream frosting and real strawberries from her garden. Hank walked Eleanor down the aisle in his one good suit, the brown one he'd bought for Dorothy's wedding 4 years earlier. He cried, which he never did. After the wedding, Eleanor and Gerald rented a small apartment above the hardware store in Bartonville. Gerald worked his way up at the dealership. Eleanor kept working at the bank. They saved carefully, spending nothing they didn't have to, eating simple meals, driving the same 1974 Ford pickup for 7 years. In 1978, Martin was born. In 1980, Karen. In 1983, Patricia. In 1987, Daniel. 4 children in 9 years. Eleanor quit the bank after Martin was born and never went back. Gerald bought a house in 1981 with a down payment they'd saved dollar by dollar for 5 years. It was a 3-bedroom colonial on Maple Lane, the nicest street in Bartonville, with a mortgage of $42,000 that felt like a mountain. Eleanor transformed it. She painted every room herself. She sewed curtains from fabric she bought on clearance. She planted a garden in the backyard that fed the family through summer and fall, canning tomatoes and green beans in the kitchen while the children played in the yard. She did everything. She packed lunches at 5:30 every morning. She drove Martin to baseball and Karen to dance and Patricia to piano and Daniel to soccer. She volunteered at every school event, every bake sale, every PTA meeting. She nursed each child through chicken pox, broken bones, bad grades, first heartbreaks. She kept the house spotless, the laundry folded, the meals on the table at 6:15 sharp. Gerald expected it. The children came to expect it. Nobody said thank you because nobody noticed. That's how it works when someone does everything perfectly. Perfection becomes invisible. Gerald's first stroke came in 2003. He was 56. Eleanor found him on the bathroom floor at 6 o'clock in the morning, one side of his face slack, unable to speak. She rode with him in the ambulance, held his hand through the scans and the waiting and the terrible uncertainty. He recovered partially, but never fully. His right side stayed weak. His speech came back slowly, thickened, like words had to fight through mud to reach his mouth. Eleanor became his caretaker overnight. She helped him dress. She cut his food. She drove him to physical therapy 3 times a week, 40 minutes each way, for 2 years. She managed his medications, his doctor's appointments, his insurance claims. She did this while still maintaining the house, still cooking, still being the gravitational center of a family that took her presence for granted the way they took oxygen for granted. You don't thank the air for being breathable. The second stroke hit in 2011. This one was worse. Gerald lost the ability to walk without a walker. He lost bladder control. He lost the man he'd been and became someone smaller, angrier, more dependent. Eleanor handled it all. She changed sheets at 3 o'clock in the morning. She cleaned up messes no wife should have to clean. She spoke to him in the same voice she'd used on their wedding day, gentle and steady, and full of a love that never once wavered, even when it had every right to. Gerald Marsh died on March 14th, 2019, at the age of 72. He died in the bed Eleanor had made that morning, with fresh sheets, because even on the morning her husband died, Eleanor Marsh made the bed. The children came for the funeral, all 4 of them, with spouses, with children of their own. They cried, they hugged Eleanor. They told her how strong she was, how grateful they were, how she'd always be taken care of. Martin, the oldest, put his hand on her shoulder at the graveside and said, "You'll never have to worry about anything, Mom. We've got you." He lied, or maybe he meant it in that moment and simply forgot. Either way, the promise had a shelf life of approximately 18 months. It started slowly. The calls became less frequent. Sunday dinners, which had been a family tradition since the children were small, stopped happening. Eleanor would call and get voicemail. She would text and get one-word replies hours later. Karen, who lived just 12 minutes away, went from visiting every week to every month to every other month. Martin moved to Delaware for a job and called on holidays. Patricia was in Charlotte and sent gift cards for Christmas. Daniel, the youngest, the one she'd been closest to, the one who'd lived with her for 2 years after Gerald's first stroke to help out, Daniel was the worst of all. He'd moved back to Bartonville in 2020, into a house 3 streets over from Maple Lane. Close enough to walk. He never walked. Eleanor's mother, Rose, had died in 1986. Her father, Hank, had followed 3 years later. The stone house on Riddle Creek Road had been left to Eleanor, the only child who stayed. But Eleanor had never moved back. She'd kept paying the minimal property taxes, $340 a year, because selling it felt like selling her mother. She visited once or twice a year, walked through the empty rooms, touched the walls her mother had touched, then locked up and drove home. She never went into the cellar. Rose had sealed it herself in the year before she died, installing a new padlock, a heavy one, and leaving the key in an envelope with a note taped to the door. The note said, "Eleanor, this is yours when you need it most, not before. You'll know when the time comes. Trust your mama." Eleanor had read that note a dozen times over the years. She never opened the lock. She trusted her mama. Now, standing in her own foyer at 72 years old, holding a garbage bag containing 46 years of a life reduced to whatever fit inside, Eleanor suddenly understood what Rose had been preparing for. "There are papers to sign," Karen said, sliding a folder across the kitchen counter. "Martin's attorney drew them up. It's straightforward. You're transferring ownership of the Maple Lane house to the 4 of us equally. In exchange, we've agreed to cover your living expenses at Cedarwood." Cedarwood, the assisted living facility on the edge of town. Eleanor had driven past it 1,000 times. It looked like a hospital pretending to be a hotel. Beige walls, fluorescent lights, a parking lot full of minivans dropping off people who would never leave. "I'm 72, Karen, Not 92. I don't need assisted living." "Mom," Daniel said, and his voice had that careful tone people use when they've already made up their minds and are just waiting for you to catch up. "The house needs $40,000 in repairs. The roof is failing. The furnace is from 1996. The property taxes are going up. We can't keep subsidizing this." Subsidizing, as if her life in the home she'd maintained for over 30 years was a charity case, as if the woman who'd raised them, nursed their father, held this family together with her bare hands, was a line item in a budget that needed trimming. "I'm not signing anything," Eleanor said quietly. "This is my home." "Actually," Martin's voice came through the speakerphone on the counter. He hadn't even driven up from Delaware. He was handling his mother's eviction by conference call. "Actually, Mom, the house was always in Dad's name. His will left it to the four of us. We've been letting you stay here as a courtesy." "A courtesy! 46 years in that house, 4 children raised, a dying husband nursed, every wall painted, every garden planted, every meal cooked. A courtesy." "You have 30 days, Karen said, not meeting Eleanor's eyes. "We've already scheduled the estate sale for December 15th. Eleanor looked at each of them, Karen adjusting her expensive handbag, Daniel checking his phone, Martin's disembodied voice waiting for compliance, Patricia's absence speaking louder than any of them. She set the folder back on the counter, unsigned. "I won't need 30 days, she said. Eleanor drove to Riddle Creek Road that same afternoon. She hadn't called ahead because there was nobody to call. The house had been empty for 38 years, sitting at the end of a gravel lane, surrounded by oaks that had been saplings when Rose was alive and were now tall enough to block out the sky. November had stripped them bare, and their branches clawed at the gray clouds like old hands reaching for something they couldn't quite grasp. She parked Gerald's old Buick in the dirt patch that had once been a driveway. The car was 14 years old and burned oil, but it was paid for, and it ran. Gerald's name was still on the registration. She hadn't had the heart to change it. The house looked exactly as houses look when they've been holding their breath for nearly 4 decades. The stone walls were intact, because stone doesn't give up easily, but everything else had surrendered. The wooden porch had collapsed on the left side, leaving splintered boards hanging like broken ribs. 2 of the 4 front windows were cracked. Dead ivy covered most of the east wall, brittle brown ropes that had climbed and died and climbed again, each generation a little higher than the last. The front door was warped in its frame and wouldn't open until Eleanor put her shoulder into it, and when it finally gave way, the smell that rushed out was the smell of stopped time. Dust and damp and old wood, and the faintest ghost of Rose's lavender sachets still hanging in closets after all these years. Eleanor stood in the front room and felt something crack inside her chest. Not grief exactly, something deeper, the recognition that she had arrived at the place her mother had always known she would end up. Not because Rose had wished it, but because Rose had understood something about the world that Eleanor had refused to see, that the people you pour yourself into don't always pour back. The house had no electricity. The power had been cut decades ago. No running water either, though the hand pump in the kitchen still worked when Eleanor primed it, coughing out rust-colored water that slowly ran clear. The wood stove in the kitchen was rusted, but structurally sound. The chimney, when she checked from outside, appeared unblocked. The roof leaked in 2 places, but most of the rooms were dry. Eleanor unloaded the Buick, the garbage bag, a sleeping bag she'd bought at the Walmart in town for $29. a flashlight, a bag of groceries, a box of kitchen matches. That was everything she owned in the world. Everything 72 years of life and 46 years of marriage had left her. That first night was the longest of her life. She spread the sleeping bag on the floor of the room that had been her parents' bedroom, the room where Rose had hummed hymns while pressing clothes, and Hank had read the paper with his glasses pushed up on his forehead. The floor was wooden, cold, and unforgiving against her back, which had been giving her trouble since Gerald got sick, and she'd spent years lifting a man twice her size. The house groaned in the wind. Animals scratched in the walls. Something large moved across the roof, probably a raccoon. And Eleanor lay perfectly still, staring at the ceiling she couldn't see in the total darkness, and felt the full weight of her situation pressed down on her like earth on a coffin. She was 72. She had no income beyond a Social Security check of $1,340 a month, which was currently being deposited into a bank account she shared with Gerald's estate, which meant the children could access it. She had no savings. Gerald had handled the money, and when he died, Martin had taken over as executor and informed Eleanor that after the funeral costs, medical debts, and various estate expenses, the balance was essentially zero. She had no home. The Maple Lane house belonged to her children. This house, the stone house on Riddle Creek Road, was the only thing in the world with her name on it, and it was a ruin. She thought about cedar wood, the fluorescent lights, the beige walls, the communal dining room where old people ate pureed food and watched game shows and waited for visitors who never came. Maybe that was easier. Maybe she should sign the papers. Maybe Karen was right, and this was for the best. But then she thought about Rose. Rose, who had raised 3 children on a seamstress's income and never once complained. Rose, who had walked through this house every day with her shoulders back and her chin up. Rose, who had stood at the cellar door every evening and descended into whatever she'd built down there and come back up lighter. "Trust your mama," Eleanor whispered into the darkness. She slept. Not well, not deeply, but she slept. The next morning Eleanor built a fire in the wood stove using branches she gathered from the yard and pages from a water-stained Sears catalog she found in a closet. The stove worked. It smoked badly at first, making her eyes sting and her lungs burn. But after 10 minutes, the draft caught, and the smoke drew up through the chimney, and heat began to pour into the kitchen like something the house had been saving up for years, waiting for someone to come back and ask for it. She boiled water from the hand pump and made instant coffee. She ate a granola bar standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the yard where Rose's garden had once been. The garden was gone, of course, swallowed by decades of weeds and wild grass, but the stone borders Rose had laid were still there, marking the edges of what had once fed a family. Eleanor spent 4 days like this, cleaning, fixing what she could, sealing the broken windows with plastic sheeting and duct tape from the hardware store in town, where she spent $34.50 and received a strange look from the teenager behind the counter when she counted out exact change from a jar of coins. She patched the roof leaks with a tarp. She scrubbed the kitchen until the original tile showed through the grime. She got the hand pump running smoothly. She stacked firewood under the porch overhang. She did not go into the cellar, not yet. Something told her she wasn't ready. Something told her that when she descended those stone steps, she needed to be in a particular state of mind, a particular state of need, and she wasn't there yet. She was still surviving. She hadn't yet reached the point where survival wasn't enough. That point came on the 5th day. It was a Thursday. November 21st. Eleanor woke to find the temperature inside the house had dropped below freezing overnight because the fire had gone out while she slept. Her joints ached so badly she could barely stand. She'd eaten the last of her groceries the night before. Her Social Security check was 4 days away, and she wasn't sure it would come to the right address. She had $11.23 in cash. She stood at the kitchen window, watching a cold rain turn the yard to mud, and she felt something she had never felt before in her life. Not sadness, not self-pity, something worse. The absolute bone-deep certainty that she had been forgotten, that she could die in this house, and nobody would know for days, maybe weeks, that her children, who she had given everything to, would not come looking. That was the moment. That was when she knew. Eleanor walked to the back of the house. The cellar door was exactly as she remembered it. Heavy oak, limestone frame, iron hinges. The padlock Rose had installed in 1985 was still there, filmed with rust, but solid. The note, taped inside a plastic sleeve Rose must have added to protect it from the weather, was still legible. "Eleanor, this is yours when you need it most, not before. You'll know when the time comes, trust your mama." The key was in the envelope, where it had been for 38 years. A brass key, old-fashioned, warm in Eleanor's cold hand. She inserted it into the padlock. It resisted. She jiggled it, applied gentle pressure, felt the mechanism inside grind against decades of rust. Then something gave. The lock clicked open. Eleanor removed the padlock. She pulled the door. The hinges groaned, deep and long, like the house itself was exhaling. A rush of cool, dry air rose from the darkness below. Not damp, not musty, dry, clean. The air of a space that had been sealed properly. Stone steps descended into blackness. Eleanor turned on her flashlight and began to walk down. There were 14 steps. She counted each one. The walls on either side were limestone, smooth and pale, and as her flashlight played across them, she noticed something immediately. They had been finished. Not rough cellar walls. These had been plastered carefully, with a surface that was almost white. Rose had done this. Rose, who could sew a straight seam with her eyes closed, had applied plaster to these walls with the same precision. At the bottom of the stairs, Eleanor stepped onto a floor that was not dirt. It was flagstone. Large, flat stones fitted together with a craftsmanship that spoke of weeks of patient labor. Her flashlight beam moved across the floor, then up the far wall, and Eleanor Marsh made a sound she didn't recognize. A sound that was part gasp, part sob, part something that has no name because it lives in the space between devastation and wonder. The cellar was a room, a real room, approximately 20 feet wide and 30 feet long, with a ceiling high enough to stand comfortably. The walls were plastered white. The floor was flagstone, and the room was not empty. It was full. Against the far wall stood a wooden workbench, hand-built, with drawers and shelves and small brass pulls. On the bench were Rose's sewing supplies, arranged with military precision, scissors, pincushions, a measuring tape coiled neatly, bolts of fabric wrapped in cotton to protect them, the colors still vivid after nearly 4 decades, blue gingham, red calico, a deep forest green wool that Eleanor remembered from the coat Rose had made her for Christmas in 1969. Next to the sewing supplies were boxes, small wooden boxes with hinged lids, the kind a carpenter would make for storing precious things. Eleanor opened the first one and found buttons, hundreds of buttons, sorted by size and color into small compartments. She opened the second and found spools of thread. The third contained ribbons, lace trimmings, and decorative braids. But that wasn't what made Eleanor's knees buckle. Along the left wall, hung in simple wooden frames, were paintings. Watercolors, small and delicate, each one depicting a scene Eleanor recognized. The house on Riddle Creek Road in summer, with Rose's garden in full bloom. The view from the kitchen window at sunrise. Eleanor as a child, maybe 6 or 7 years old, sitting on the porch steps with a cat in her lap. Eleanor in her high school graduation gown. Eleanor on her wedding day, walking down the aisle with Hank. Eleanor holding baby Martin in the hospital, her face exhausted and radiant, and full of a love so fierce it came through the painted paper like heat through glass. Rose had painted these. Rose, who had never once mentioned that she could paint. Rose, who had disappeared into this cellar every evening and created art that nobody ever saw. Art that was never meant for walls in a house where Hank would have been embarrassed by sentimentality and the children would have smeared fingerprints on the glass. This was Rose's secret. This was her thinking room, not thinking, creating, preserving, building a record of love in the only place it would be safe. Eleanor sat on the flagstone floor and wept. She wept for her mother, who had carried this talent in silence. She wept for herself, who had carried a family in silence. She wept for the terrible symmetry of it, that women hide the best parts of themselves in cellars and closets and quiet hours after dinner because the world doesn't make room for them to exist in the light. When the crying stopped, she looked more carefully. Behind the workbench, she found a wooden trunk, heavy, oak, iron-banded, locked with a smaller lock that opened with the same brass key. Inside the trunk, wrapped in layers of cotton batting, were Rose's diaries, 23 leather-bound journals, each one filled with Rose's small, precise handwriting. The first was dated 1952, 2 years before Eleanor was born. The last was dated December 1985, 3 months before Rose died. Eleanor opened the last journal first. The final entry read, December 3rd, 1985. The cellar is ready. Everything is in its place. I've done everything I can to protect what matters. When Eleanor comes down here, and she will, because life will eventually send her down these stairs the way it sends all women to the places their mothers prepared, she'll find what I've left. Not just the sewing things and the paintings, though I hope those bring her comfort. The real gift is in the trunk behind the bench, the second compartment. I couldn't tell her while I was alive because Hank would have worried, and the other children would have fought over it. But Eleanor is the one who stayed. Eleanor is the one who understood that love is work, and work is love, and both are invisible until they're gone. She deserves every bit of what I've saved, my sweet girl, my best thing. Trust your mama, baby. Eleanor's hands were shaking. She lifted the cotton batting in the trunk and found the second compartment, a false bottom built so cleverly that you'd never know it was there unless you were told. Inside were 3 things. The first was a manila envelope containing the deed to the Riddle Creek Road property. Not just the house, the full property, 47 acres. Eleanor had always believed the house sat on a small lot. She had never looked at the deed. Rose had quietly purchased adjacent parcels over 3 decades, paying in cash from her seamstress work, $200 here, $500 there, buying land nobody else wanted for prices nobody else would have paid, assembling the pieces of a puzzle that nobody knew she was building. The second was a savings passbook from Bartonville Savings and Loan. the same bank where Eleanor had once worked. The account was in Rose's name, with Eleanor listed as the beneficiary. The last recorded balance was $143,000 in 1985 dollars. Eleanor's mind struggled with the math. $143,000 in 1985, sitting in a savings account for 38 years, even at modest interest rates, compounding over nearly 4 decades. The third was a letter, 2 pages, written in Rose's hand, dated the same day as the final journal entry. My dearest Eleanor, if you're reading this, then the thing I always feared has happened. The people you loved didn't love you back the way you deserved. I know this because I watched it happen to my own mother and her mother before her. Women in our family love too much, give too much, and the world takes it as permission to take everything else. But I want you to know something. You are not poor. You have never been poor. While you were raising those children and nursing that husband and cooking those meals and painting those walls, I was down here in this cellar, saving every extra cent from every dress I sewed, every alteration I did, every curtain I hemmed for the women in this town who could afford to pay someone else to do what they didn't want to do themselves. I never spent it. I never told Hank. I never told James or Dorothy. I saved it for you, because you were the one who would need it. Not because you're weak, because you're the kind of strong that the world punishes, the kind that gives until there's nothing left, and then gives the nothing too. This money is yours. The land is yours. This cellar is yours. And if you're standing here reading this, then you already know the most important thing I could ever tell you. Sometimes the place you're supposed to end up is the place you started. Come home, baby girl. Mama built you a foundation. Now go build something on it. All my love, forever and past forever, Rose. Eleanor sat on the flagstone floor of her mother's cellar, holding her mother's letter in her mother's secret room, surrounded by her mother's hidden paintings and her mother's hidden savings and her mother's hidden love. And she understood finally what Rose had been doing down here every evening for all those years. She had been building a net, a safety net woven from pennies and patience and the fierce, quiet certainty that the world would eventually do to Eleanor what it does to every woman who gives more than she keeps. Rose had seen it coming 38 years before it arrived, and she had prepared. The next morning, Eleanor drove to the Bartonville Savings and Loan. She brought the passbook, her identification, and Rose's death certificate, which she'd kept in a fireproof box for decades. The bank manager, a woman named Catherine Oates, who was young enough to be Eleanor's granddaughter, pulled up the account records and went very quiet. "Mrs. Marsh," she said carefully, "this account has been accruing interest since 1985. With compound interest over 38 years, the current balance is," she paused, checking the screen twice, $412,614.37. $412,614.37. Rose had turned a seamstress's savings into a small fortune by doing the one thing none of her children had ever learned to do. She'd been patient. Eleanor didn't react visibly. She simply nodded, as if her mother, leaving her nearly $500,000 from beyond the grave, was exactly what she'd expected. Inside, her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her teeth. "I'd like to set up a new account," Eleanor said, "in my name only." Over the next 6 months, Eleanor Marsh transformed the stone house on Riddle Creek Road into something her mother would have recognized and something her children would never have believed. She hired a contractor from the next town over, a quiet man named Everett Cole, who specialized in restoring old stone houses. Everett walked the property, examined the walls, tested the foundation, and told Eleanor what she already suspected. The bones of the house were extraordinary. Built in 1902 by masons who knew what they were doing, the stone walls were 18 inches thick, structurally perfect, and would outlast anything built in the last 50 years. The issues were surface level: roof, windows, plumbing, electrical, all fixable, all temporary problems wearing the costume of permanent ruin. The repairs cost $87,000. New slate roof, new windows that matched the original style, modern plumbing and electrical, carefully concealed within the old walls, a new wood stove, high efficiency, that heated the entire ground floor. The hand pump in the kitchen was kept as a backup, because Eleanor was her mother's daughter and believed in redundancy. She restored the cellar, too, not changed it, restored it. Rose's workbench stayed exactly where it was. The paintings stayed on the walls, the journals stayed in the trunk, but Eleanor added lighting, proper ventilation, and a dehumidification system to protect the paintings. She had the watercolors professionally appraised. The art appraiser, a woman from Philadelphia who specialized in American folk art, spent 3 hours in the cellar and emerged with tears in her eyes. "These are remarkable," she told Eleanor. "The technique is entirely self-taught, which makes them even more valuable. The emotional authenticity is extraordinary. I would estimate the collection at somewhere between $60,000 and $90,000 at auction, possibly more, given the story behind them." Eleanor shook her head. "They're not for sale." She turned the 47 acres into something, too. Rose had bought well. The land included a stretch of Riddle Creek, 12 acres of mature hardwood forest, and a meadow that caught sunlight from dawn to dusk. Eleanor hired an agricultural consultant who told her the meadow soil was exceptional, rich and deep, perfect for growing almost anything. She planted a garden first, then a larger garden. Then she began renting portions of the meadow to young farmers in the area who couldn't afford their own land, charging below market rate because she remembered what it felt like to count coins. She opened the house to the community, not as a business, as a gathering place. She hosted dinners on Friday evenings, cooking the same recipes Rose had taught her 50 years earlier, and word spread through Bartonville the way it always had, by mouth, by rumor, by the smell of bread baking in a stone house that everyone had assumed was empty. People came, neighbors she hadn't seen in decades, young families who'd moved to Bartonville for the quiet and found it lonely, elderly women who lived alone and hadn't been invited anywhere in years. They came, and they sat at Eleanor's table, and they ate, and they talked, and they felt for an hour or two like they belonged to something. The Friday dinners became an institution. Within 3 months, Eleanor was feeding 20 people every week. Within 6 months, 35. She never charged a cent. She didn't need to. Rose had given her more than enough. Eleanor also discovered something about herself in those months, something Rose had known all along. She was not invisible. She had never been invisible. She had simply been surrounded by people who chose not to see her. Here, at the stone house on Riddle Creek Road, she was seen. The young farmers called her Miss Eleanor, and brought her vegetables from the land she rented them. The elderly women brought quilts and stories and the kind of companionship that comes from shared experience. Everett Cole stopped by on weekends to check on things and stayed for coffee and, eventually, for dinner. and eventually became the first genuine friend Eleanor had made in 40 years. She was, for the first time in her adult life, happy. Not the performing happiness of a woman who smiles because it's expected. Real happiness. The kind that comes from being exactly where you're supposed to be, doing exactly what you were put here to do, surrounded by people who see you clearly and value what they see. It took the children 7 months to notice. Karen found out first. She'd driven past the Riddle Creek Road property on her way to somewhere else and seen the new roof, the restored windows, the cars parked in the driveway on a Friday evening. She didn't stop. She went home and called Martin. "Something's going on with Mom's old house," she said. "It looks renovated. There are people there." Martin did what Martin always did. He called his attorney. Within a week, all 4 children knew about the property restoration, and within 2 weeks they showed up, all 4 of them, at the same time on a Saturday morning. The first time they'd all been in the same room since the day they'd handed Eleanor a garbage bag and 30 days' notice. Eleanor was in the garden when they arrived. She saw Martin's BMW, Karen's Lexus, Patricia's rental car, and Daniel's truck come up the gravel lane like a caravan of regret. She stood up, wiped the dirt from her hands, and waited. "Mom," Martin said, getting out of the car with the same confident stride he'd used his whole life, the walk of a man who assumed every room would rearrange itself to accommodate him. "We need to talk about this property." "Hello, Martin. It's been 7 months. You look well." He ignored the observation. "Karen tells me you've done extensive renovations. Where did you get the money for this?" "That's not really your concern." "It is our concern," Karen said, stepping forward with her arms crossed, the same posture she'd used the day she evicted Eleanor. "If Dad left money we didn't know about, it's part of the estate. We have a right to it." Eleanor looked at her daughter, really looked at her, and for the first time she didn't see the little girl she'd driven to dance class. She saw Gerald. The entitlement, the assumption that everything within arm's reach belonged to him, the certainty that other people's resources were just misplaced assets waiting to be correctly allocated. "Your father didn't leave me anything except a garbage bag and 30 days, Eleanor said evenly. "This property was left to me by my mother. The money was left to me by my mother. In an account that has been in my name since 1985, long before your father died, long before his estate existed. Your father's attorney can confirm that none of this has any connection to Gerald's assets." Silence. "But," Daniel started. "But what, Daniel? But you thought I would just disappear? That you could put me in Cedarwood and sell the house and split the money and never have to think about me again?" Daniel looked at the ground. At least he had the decency for that. "I want you to listen to me carefully," Eleanor said, and her voice was Rose's voice now, steady and warm and underlaid with a foundation of stone that no one could crack. "I am not angry. Anger would mean I expected something different from you, and I have learned not to expect. But I am clear. This property is mine. This home is mine. This life is mine. I built it with what my mother left me, and my mother left it to me because she knew, 38 years before it happened, that the people I loved would eventually leave me with nothing. She let that land? You are welcome here," she continued, "all 4 of you. You are welcome at my Friday dinners. You are welcome to visit your grandmother's cellar and see the paintings she made and read the journals she kept. You are welcome to know the woman your grandmother was, a woman who saved every extra penny for 30 years to make sure her daughter would never be powerless. But you are not welcome to claim what isn't yours. You are not welcome to treat me as a line item. And you are not welcome to pretend that what happened on Maple Lane didn't happen, because it did, and I have forgiven it, but I have not forgotten it, and there is a difference. Karen's eyes were wet. Patricia was openly crying. She'd driven from Charlotte. She'd been the one who sent the text, "It's for the best, Mom." Now she stood in the garden of a house she'd never valued, and looked at a mother she'd never truly seen and understood, perhaps for the first time, the weight of what she'd done. Martin said nothing. He stood very still, his attorney's brain running through the legal implications and finding nothing to grab onto. No claim, no leverage, no angle. Daniel spoke last. "Mom, I'm sorry." 2 words, the only honest thing any of them said that morning. Eleanor nodded. "I know you are, and I love you. All of you. That's the part you never understood. A mother's love doesn't have conditions, but a mother's trust does. And trust, once it's broken, has to be rebuilt the same way my mother built this cellar. One stone at a time, one honest act at a time, over years, not minutes." She turned back to her garden. "I'm making pot roast for Friday dinner. You're welcome to come." The stone house on Riddle Creek Road stands today much as it stood when Rose Calloway built the cellar beneath it. The walls are thick and true. The garden feeds a community. The cellar, now properly lit and climate-controlled, holds Rose's paintings and journals, preserved for the generation that will come after Eleanor and the generation after that. On Friday evenings, the windows glow warm against the dark Pennsylvania hills, and anyone who comes up the gravel lane will find a table set for as many as show up, and a woman in the kitchen who has learned, at 72, the lesson her mother spent a lifetime teaching, that the places the world calls worthless are often the places love has been hiding, that a cellar sealed for 38 years can hold more value than a mansion on the nicest street in town, that a seamstress with a secret talent and a patient savings account can build a legacy that outlasts every fortune built on pride, and that a woman who gives everything, who is thanked for nothing, who is discarded by the people she created, can still stand up, brush the dirt off her hands, and build a life so beautiful that the people who abandoned her will drive down a gravel road on a Saturday morning just to stand in her garden and ask to be let back in. My heart overflows with gratitude that you stayed with Eleanor through every moment of her extraordinary journey, from the garbage bag in the foyer to the flagstone floor of Rose's cellar, from the cruelest words a mother can hear to the quietest, most powerful response a mother can give. If her story touched something deep inside you, if you've ever given everything and received nothing, if you've ever been told you're a burden by the people who owe you everything, if you've ever discovered that the place you started was the place you were meant to return to, then leave just one word in the comments. One word that describes the moment you realized your own worth. Because Eleanor's story proves something that cannot be argued with. That patience outlasts greed every single time. That love hides in the places the world calls worthless. That a mother's preparation can cross decades and still arrive exactly when it's needed. That you are never too old to discover who you were always meant to become. And that the people who throw you away will eventually come looking for what they lost. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that what the world calls empty might be full of treasure. That what the world calls finished might just be getting started. That the people who love you most might have been building you a foundation in silence, waiting for you to finally come home and stand on it. Because together, we prove that hearts don't rust, that strength doesn't corrode, and that sometimes the greatest inheritance is the one nobody knew existed, hidden in a cellar by a woman who loved you enough to prepare for the worst and leave you the best. Welcome to our family. We'll see you in the next story.